Thanks very much, Colin, for that kind introduction, and thank you very much to CEDA for making today's lunch possible. I'd just like to start by adding my acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also, I'm sure you'll all be disappointed that I'm not Robin Denham, but I will talk a little bit about Tesla and moonshots in that context before I talk a little bit about the situation in Australia, and then hopefully have some vibrant conversation towards the end. As I say, I wanted to start with a short hat tip to Robin. She's that species that is actually much rarer than we would like to see, a successful female Australian in the technology sector. We'd like to see a lot more of those. And she has recently taken over the job as chair of Tesla, which the FT helpfully noted was probably the toughest gig in corporate America, keeping Elon Musk under control. So hat tip to her, and good luck to her for what is a particularly challenging job. But it's interesting, as we're talking about moonshots, to reflect a little bit on the history of Tesla as a company. Elon Musk, the mercurial chief executive, led the Series A investment in Tesla in 2004. And as you can walk around today and see lots of Teslas on the street, it's easy to forget that at that time electric vehicles were very much a moonshot. In fact, in 2006, a documentary was made, Who Killed the Electric Car?, which is about General Motors' attempts to get their version of electric car, the EV1, into the market. So in 2006, people thought the electric car had been killed, and the documentary laid the blame pretty much at big oil and big car, big auto as the causes of that decline. But Elon Musk said no. He saw a future, and he was pretty open about it. If you go back to that time, he laid out what he called his master plan, which was to attack the electric car market from the top, from the luxury end of the market. And so we get the Roadster and the Model S, and then ultimately the Model 3. And I'm sure some of my colleagues from the Sydney Business School may well be teaching that as a case study in corporate strategy, because it's an interesting story about how to break into new models. But along the way, it's demonstrated a lot of really interesting things about moonshots. And about the pursuit of large-scale ambition. First of all, Elon did an unusual thing. He opened up Tesla's patent portfolio and said, actually, competitors, please use our patents, because we want to create a marketplace for electric vehicles. We want to create standards on which they can be built. And so he invited people in to work on a common platform with that early on. And importantly, it's also worth reflecting that the story of Tesla is not the story just of a private sector entrepreneur triumphing against the odds. Our old friend, the US government, has played a pretty significant role in the development of Tesla as a company. Back in 2009, they gave Tesla a $465 million US loan to help the company get off the ground. The company paid that loan back in full about 5 years later, but it's interesting to note that the government was prepared to be an investor at a very early stage of that company's existence. It's also non-trivial that Tesla started life in California, and it was the California Air Resources Board that set standards for automotive emissions that played a critical role in enabling the emergence of low-emission vehicles and battery vehicles in particular. So I guess if we look at a Tesla as an example of a moonshot, you see a few things. You certainly see inspirational leadership. You certainly see a long-term time horizon. But you also see interesting efforts to create platforms where different organisations can come together. And you also see a critical role played by government and the private sector working together. And if you're an investor in Tesla at the moment, you probably know that the success, the question of whether Tesla will ultimately be successful is probably still, the jury is still out on that one. But if you look at the new vehicle pipelines of leading automakers from around the world, and you say that Tesla's or Elon Musk's vision was to put electric cars on the map and make them a reality, you'd have to say that they've absolutely succeeded. Because if you look at the pipeline of vehicles that are now in the marketplace and coming to Australia over the next little while, it is incredibly strong. So you'd have to say that as a moonshot, I think Elon's been very successful in making electric vehicles successful. But my last comment on Elon before I get on to the more Australian picture is a quote he made a few years ago. He said, "Technology leadership is not defined by patents, which history has repeatedly shown to be a small protection indeed against a determined competitor, but rather by the ability of a company to attract and motivate the world's most talented engineers." Now, as an engineer, of course, attracting talented engineers is the most important thing you can do, but it really echoes my experience of working in the innovation space for a long period of time, that as much as everyone thinks innovation is about technology and about technical development, a lot of it's about people. And that's why I think today's session is entitled Moonshots, Culture, Ambition and Innovation, because culture and ambition are people things, they're not technology things. But I think moonshots have a lot to say to us and can do a lot for us in thinking about the culture and ambition of our national innovation system. So what do I mean by moonshots? Well, let's get into a little bit of detail, and I'll try and set the scene for the conversation that we're going to have after lunch. Innovation, moonshots or mission-oriented innovation, the best description comes from a British economist called Mariana Mazzucato, who said the mission-oriented innovation policy responds to grand challenges by identifying and articulating concrete problems that can galvanise production, distribution and consumption patterns across various sectors. Focuses on concrete problems that require system-wide transformation across different types of sectors and involve partnerships between different actors. And I hope you can see that a lot of those trends were evident in the Tesla story. Now, the conversation about missions and moonshots is not confined to Australia. It's something that's actually very active internationally. In fact, the EU is actively considering, as part of their next framework for European innovation policy, and a recent report, they identified about 132 ongoing mission initiatives around the world in 32 different countries. So we're not unique, if you like, in thinking about innovation, about moonshots and missions as a way to frame innovation. And Colin, in his introduction, pointed to the UK, who when they're not preoccupied with Brexit, are implementing an industrial strategy which includes a significant commitment to mission-based innovation. So the UK has identified 4 grand challenges: the ageing society, the future of mobility, clean growth and AI and data. And they have identified missions to go under each of those. So, for example, under the ageing society, their mission is to ensure that people can enjoy at least 5 extra healthy, independent years of life by 2035, while narrowing the gap between the experience of richest and poorest. So there's something that you can unite a very complex healthcare system around. And they have missions against each of their other grand challenges. So this is a trend that seems to be emerging around the world. We can talk a little bit about why that might be. It offers an opportunity, but I just want to put a little bit of a caveat against it. Again, Colin mentioned at the start John F. Kennedy's race to the moon in the 1960s, and what is not often mentioned is that the commitment to go to the moon at its peak chewed up 3% of US GDP. And that is a significant number. To give you a sense, that was government funding to go to the moon. In Australia, we spend a little bit less than 1% of GDP on all R&D and all science altogether. So the scale of ambition to go to the moon is one thing, but nonetheless, there are some really interesting and exciting missions that I think we could use mission-oriented thinking to tackle in Australia. And so that was a theme that we picked up in our report to government, which was published earlier last year, called 2030 Australia 2030 Prosperity Through Innovation. We recommended that the government should take on mission-based innovation as a sort of framing policy instrument. Why do we do that? Well, I'll give you a few reasons. The first thing was that as part of doing the 2030 plan, we went around the country and we spoke to innovators from north and south, east and west around the country. And one of the recurring comments that we got was a pervasive sense amongst our practitioners that they wanted to be part of something bigger, they wanted to tackle something bigger, but they felt that Australians were just not really having a go on a big enough scale. They wanted to see efforts to innovate coalesce into something bigger. And I wondered at the time if that's something about Australia wanting to be a bit laconic. The Australian character is not to put yourself out there a little bit too much, an unwillingness to take big risks. But what we heard from the people who are at the front lines was actually a yearning to do precisely that. And comes back, I think, to Elon's quote that in the contest for talented people, being able to give them a vision and get them working on the most exciting stuff is really critical. The other thing we heard as part of the 2030 plan was talking to international companies. And we said, what would it take for you to invest more here in Australia? And they said, well, look, the reality is that we operate a global R&D organisation. We get our innovation from wherever the best people are. And if you want to attract our attention, you want to get us to invest in Australia, you need to tell us what's important to you. You need to signal to us very clearly where you are going to make a long-term commitment as a nation to driving innovation. So I think missions play a key role in engaging corporations. The other thing that we heard was, again, coming back to Elon's point about talent, talented people are going to where the opportunities are. So I've got some friends who are in Silicon Valley working on autonomous vehicles, because that's where the exciting stuff is happening in autonomous vehicles. What are the exciting things that are happening in Australia that can attract talent from around the world, and how are we telling that story to those both international people looking to come to Australia and expats looking to return? And the final reason I think we were very attracted to the idea of mission-based innovation is that if you read the Productivity Commission's report on the Australian economy of last year, it was called Shifting the Dial, and it talked about some of the areas that Australia could work on to drive productivity growth. You'll notice that several of those areas are very complex in a governance sense. So they involve state and territory governments alongside the federal government, local government. They involve private sector, not-for-profit agencies all working together. And to galvanise action against some of those problems, which we would call in the jargon wicked problems, clear signals, clear goals, clear outcomes that you're trying to get to can play a critical role in actually tackling some of those challenges. So there's some of the reasons why we, having gone around the country and listened and heard what people were saying, we recommended that government should put mission-based innovation closer to the heart of its innovation agenda. And I guess as I listen now to the pending election debate, and note that the word innovation didn't make it into the Treasurer's speech nor into Bill Shorten's speech last week, there's a desperate need for us to be talking about the power of innovation to make positive social change. And at some point people glaze over when I cite R&D statistics or patenting activity or other things like that. If you can articulate a message that says we can actually make Australia a better place, we can solve some of these problems using innovation, I think we have an opportunity to rekindle what I think is a very important national conversation. So what's involved? Well, I mentioned earlier the British economist Mariana Mazzucato, who's been leading a lot of the thinking in this work. She's identified 5 criteria for setting a mission. First is that they should be bold, inspirational, with wide societal relevance. So something big will inspire people more than something small. Targeted, measurable and time-bound. It's easy to have a dream, but if you don't put some constraints around it, it's just hallucination. So you've got to have measurable and time-bound objectives. It needs to be ambitious, but realistic, given research and innovation. There are certain trends that we can see in technology that we can count on being there in the future. So as we think about where technology might go, I think we can be ambitious but also realistic. I mentioned before, they need to be cross-disciplinary, cross-sector and cross-actor. The whole point of a mission is to galvanise a group of disparate actors who wouldn't come together otherwise to actually come together and work together effectively. And they need to, and this is something that's a little bit unusual and challenging sometimes for government, they need to enable multiple competing and bottom-up solutions. So in a typical mission structure, you'll have multiple teams trying to solve the same problem in multiple different ways. Something that worked very well in the Apollo program, where they had multiple redundancies built into the system. And if we want to think about missions, we've got to be prepared to take different approaches. There's not just a single way to solve every given problem. And so they're the 5 that Mariana Mazzucato has articulated. We would also add, I guess, a 6th, that you need to have a clear governance structure from a public policy perspective to manage the selection and ongoing management of missions. And I'm pleased to say one of our recommendations in the 2030 plan last year was that the government should do this. The government is now doing this. There is a group within the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science working on exactly such a framework, and we look forward to that influencing and informing policy making going forward. So that all sounds pretty easy, right? We should just do missions. Well, it's not that easy. There are plenty of challenges when it comes to doing missions, and I'm sure we'll explore these in the Q&A afterwards. The first is, how do you choose? There are lots of candidate missions. Everyone that we talk to has an idea for a mission that they would want to see us go for. How do you choose that? How do you engage with the citizenry to decide that? A few years ago in Australia, we had Kevin Rudd's 2020 Summit, which aspired to set some goals for the country over the long term. More recently, at a local level, we've had citizen assemblies and other mechanisms to poll the public. But I think that's a really live question for us to think about. If we do want to have missions, and as I say, I hear a lot of interest, how are we going to choose them? How are we going to decide them? How are we going to give them the legitimacy to go forward? The second challenge, once you've chosen them, how do you structure them for success? I've said they need to be cross-sectoral. I've said they need to engage public and private sectors together. But the detail of how you make that happen, what the governance structure you put on top of that, is challenging. And unfortunately, the data shows that in Australia, we are not good collaborators either across business grounds or across sectoral grounds. So that's going to be a particular challenge, I think, for Australia. The third one that I often get asked about when I talk to government ministers, well, what is the role for government? I mentioned earlier on that in the case of Tesla, the government played a critical role both in providing finance and in also providing regulatory support to enable uptake of EVs. So there are clearly roles for government, but how do you make sure the government is facilitative without being overbearing? And I think that brings me to the fourth challenge, which is, you've got to realise, you've got to accept the reality that today trust in a lot of our institutions is low. Trust in many private sector organisations is low, and trust in government is comparatively low. Are we, in pursuing missions, swimming against, if you like, the Donald Trump what's good for me is all I care about, to a mode where we say, what's good for the country is what we care about? That'll challenge our democracy. That'll challenge the way we think about our interests. But as I say, I think that the prizes at the other end are worth it. So that I just wanted to make those remarks to really frame, I think, what will be an interesting conversation after lunch. Hopefully you can have some interesting conversations over lunch. I just want to close by saying I'm pretty optimistic about the future, just as I'm optimistic for Tesla and for Robin and her role in Tesla. I think the future looks very bright if we can harness innovation to solve some of these big challenges and if we can get innovation back into the national debate. Thanks very much.